The frozen night was suddenly shattered by the thunderous roar of dragon wings as Maelstrom, Scourge, and Vermilion appeared in the skies above the wall. Their immense forms blotted out the stars, casting long shadows across the encampment below. This time they were different. The dragons had grown larger, more imposing than ever before. Their previously distinct colors had faded into uniformity. Deep black scales, streaked with veins of molten red, pulsing like fire beneath the surface. Their eyes glowed an ominous crimson, radiating a primal power that sent chills through even the bravest of warriors. These were not just dragons. They were living embodiments of fire and fury, forged anew by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The fire priests ceased their chanting and turned their faces skyward, their voices rising in reverent praise. The flames of their ritual seemed to respond to the dragons, burning even brighter, their fiery beacon piercing the heavens. The dragons descended slowly, their wings creating gusts of wind that threatened to topple tents and extinguish torches. When they landed near the ritual site, the ground trembled under their massive weight. The three beasts stood side by side, their sheer presence overwhelming. Maelstrom, the largest of the trio, let out a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of those who heard it. The assembled armies erupted in a deafening cheer. Soldiers from every house, Lannister, Stark, Baratheon, Tyrell, and the Vale, raised their weapons in the air, their voices carrying a mix of awe and hope. The sight of such power, unified against the darkness, was a beacon of inspiration amidst the despair of the looming battle. The gods themselves couldn't stop those beasts. A knight of the Vale muttered, his voice trembling with awe. "They'll burn the dead to ash," a Tyrell archer said, his grin wide. "We'll have nothing to do but pick off the stragglers." Even the wildlings, accustomed to the terrifying stories of the dragons of old, couldn't help but cheer at the sight. They had seen the horrors of the Night King's army firsthand, and this display of power was the first hope they had felt in what seemed like an eternity. But amidst the cheering and revelry, there were those who remained vigilant. On a high platform overlooking the encampment, Robert Baratheon, Stannis Baratheon, and Eddard Stark stood, their faces grim as they watched the dragons. Robert, his warhammer resting against his shoulder, grunted. "Impressive," he admitted, his tone carrying a grudging respect. "Those beasts could turn the tide, but power like that, it's dangerous, too dangerous." Stannis, ever stoic, nodded slightly. "Power unchecked is a threat in itself. The dragons may fight for us now, but what happens when the dead are gone? Who will they fight for then?" Ned's gaze remained fixed on the dragons, his expression unreadable. "They're tools, nothing more," he said quietly, "but tools wielded by those with ambition. We must ensure that ambition doesn't destroy what we're trying to save." Robert turned to Varos, who had remained near the fire priests, watching the scene with an inscrutable expression. "Those dragons of yours," Robert called out, his voice cutting through the cheers. "They're stronger than before, larger. What have you done to them, Valyrian?" Varos turned slowly, his fiery gaze meeting Robert's. "The dragons are what they were always meant to be," he said simply. "They have awakened to their purpose, to stand against the darkness and ensure the survival of the living." Robert's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his warhammer. "Their purpose or yours?" Varos didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the dragons, his voice calm but resonant. "Their purpose is clear, Baratheon, as is mine. Tonight, the living will see the full might of fire and blood. That is all you need to know." Robert exchanged a wary glance with Stannis and Ned, his unease evident, but he said no more, his focus returning to the preparations for the battle. Below, the armies began to move into position, emboldened by the sight of the dragons. Their cheers continued to echo across the frozen expanse, their voices a chorus of defiance against the impending darkness. The dragons stood like sentinels, their glowing red eyes scanning the horizon where the first shadows of the Night King's army began to emerge. The battle was upon them, and the living were ready to meet it with every ounce of strength and fire they possessed. The chilling sound of the Night's Watch horn, blown 3 times, echoed across the frozen expanse. It was the signal that everyone had dreaded but prepared for. White Walkers were here. From the ramparts of the wall, the defenders could see it. A vast, endless sea of the undead stretching to the horizon. The icy mist that accompanied the White Walkers cloaked the horde, and within the fog, eerie blue lights gleamed like stars. The eyes of the Whites. At the forefront were monstrous giants and other twisted, ungodly beasts, towering over the mass of death. Some carried massive weapons made of ice. Others used their sheer size to crush anything in their path. And then there were the chains, great lengths of icy steel that glinted menacingly in the pale light as the White Walkers prepared to pull down the wall's gates. The horn's final echoes faded, replaced by the sound of the Whites' relentless march. From atop the wall, the defenders moved into action. Robert Baratheon stood on a high platform, flanked by Stannis and Ned Stark, surveying the chaos below. "They've brought chains to tear the gates out," Robert growled. "They mean to flood through the tunnel." "They'll hit Varos's men first," Stannis said, his voice steady. "If they break through there, we're finished." "They won't break through," Ned said firmly. "They can't." Down below, at the entrance to the tunnel, Varos's Valyrian host, reinforced by House Tyrell soldiers, stood in formation. Their heavy red and black armor gleamed in the flickering light of the fires, and their shields and spears formed an impenetrable phalanx. Behind them, fire priests stood chanting, their voices rising over the din as flames danced on their staffs. The Lannister archers, stationed along the wall's heights, began firing down on the mass of Whites. Their dragonglass-tipped arrows struck true, dropping dozens of the undead with each volley. Still, the horde pressed forward, their numbers seemingly endless. The unsullied, ever-disciplined, were spread across the defensive lines below the wall. Alongside them were Stark bannermen, their swords and axes ready, their faces grim. Knights of the Vale remained in reserve, their cavalry ready to charge at a moment's notice should the Whites breach the defenses. As the Whites surged toward the wall, the archers rained death down upon them. The air filled with the sharp hiss of arrows and the shrieks of the undead as the dragonglass pierced their icy forms. But the Whites were relentless, their numbers so vast that the fallen were quickly replaced by more. The giants moved toward the gates, their massive forms towering over the battlefield. Each step they took sent tremors through the ground. The chains they carried clinked ominously as they positioned themselves to rip the steel doors out of the tunnel's entrance. Behind them, White Walkers on horseback moved with eerie calm, their glowing blue eyes surveying the battlefield with cold precision. Varos, standing at the forefront of his host, raised a hand, signaling his soldiers to hold their ground. His fiery gaze locked on the advancing giants, and he muttered something under his breath, a command or perhaps a prayer. The Valyrian host braced, their shields interlocking as they prepared for the impact. Above, the dragons, Maelstrom, Scourge, and Vermilion, circled the battlefield, their immense forms casting long shadows over the wall. Their growls reverberated through the air, a constant reminder of the firepower that remained in reserve. "Let them come," Robert muttered, watching the unfolding battle. "If this is the end, we'll make sure those icy bastards remember it." The Whites began massing at the entrance to the tunnel, clawing and scrabbling at the steel doors. The giants bellowed, their icy breath visible as they gripped the chains and began pulling. The steel groaned under the strain, the sound echoing ominously. "Archers," Robert roared, "focus fire on those bloody giants. Bring them down." The archers obeyed, targeting the giants with a concentrated volley of arrows. Several fell, their massive forms collapsing with thunderous crashes, but more took their place, their strength undiminished. Below, the Unsullied held the line as Whites surged toward the wall's outer defenses. Their spears thrust with mechanical precision, each strike killing a White before they could breach the formation. The Starks, fighting alongside them, swung their swords with ferocity, their war cries rising above the cacophony. Despite the chaos, The Knights of the Vale remained poised, their cavalry ready to charge at the first sign of a breach. Renly Baratheon, commanding the reserves, kept a watchful eye, his hand on his sword. "Hold," he ordered his men. "If they break through, we'll ride them down." As the battle raged, the White Walkers watched from the rear of their army, their icy composure unshaken. They did not command with shouts or gestures. Their presence alone seemed to guide the horde, their blue eyes fixed on the wall. And yet, for all the despair, the living fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Every archer, every soldier, every fire priest knew that this was more than a battle. It was a fight for survival itself. If this was the end of the living, the White Walkers would remember it as the fight that challenged their very existence. The flames of the living burned brighter than ever, and the wall became a battlefield where the fate of the world hung in the balance. Varos stood atop the battlefield, his fiery gaze fixed on the chaos below. Maelstrom, Scourge, and Vermilion circled high above, their colossal forms ominous shadows in the night sky. Despite the cries of commanders to unleash the dragons, Varos held them back, his expression resolute. The firepower of the dragons, though a devastating weapon, posed a risk to the wall's ancient magic. Their flames were so potent that they could compromise the very structure meant to hold the dead at bay. Below, the battle had reached a critical point. The giant White Walkers, their icy forms glinting with an unnatural glow, had succeeded in pulling the steel doors from the wall's entrance. The ground trembled as the massive barriers were torn free, leaving the tunnel exposed. With an eerie, synchronized motion, the Whites began to flood the passage, their guttural snarls and relentless movement overwhelming the senses. Varos's Valyrian elite, stationed in the tunnel, braced themselves for the onslaught. Their interlocking shields created a fortress of steel and flame, while their dragonglass-dipped spears thrust with deadly precision. The fire priests chanted behind them, their flames providing both light and a constant barrier against the encroaching dead. The Whites came in waves, clawing, biting, and slamming against the phalanx. The Valyrian soldiers held firm, their discipline and training shining in the face of such overwhelming odds. Their black and red armor, enchanted with Valyrian fire runes, seemed to repel the frost emanating from the undead. But the sheer volume of Whites began to strain even their formidable defenses. From his vantage point, Robert Baratheon, watching with Ned Stark and Stannis, bellowed, "Hold the line! Those gates were built to keep the living out. Show them how we hold against the dead." The combined forces of archers and dragonglass artillery above the wall continued to rain destruction down on the Whites outside, but it did little to slow the surge into the tunnel. The sounds of battle, metal against ice, the roars of commanders, and the guttural snarls of the dead filled the air, echoing off the ancient stone. Then, a new presence entered the fray. The White Walker leaders, their skeletal forms cloaked in icy mist, descended into the tunnel. Each step they took sent a palpable chill through the air, frost spreading along the ground in their wake. They moved slowly, methodically, their glowing blue eyes fixed on the Valyrian soldiers ahead. The tide of the battle shifted immediately. The White Walkers' presence strengthened the Whites, who surged forward with renewed ferocity. The Valyrian soldiers, despite their best efforts, began to lose ground. The shields of the phalanx trembled under the relentless assault. In the heart of the tunnel, the White Walker leaders raised their icy weapons. One swung his spear, shattering a section of the Valyrian line. Another summoned a wave of frost, freezing several soldiers in place. The dragonglass weapons were still effective, but the White Walkers were far more deliberate and precise than the mindless Whites. Varos's fiery gaze remained fixed on the tunnel. He knew this was a test, not just of his soldiers but of the resilience of the living. His hand twitched at the hilt of his blade, his instincts screaming for him to act. But he held back, watching, waiting. Now, Daenerys's voice broke through the tension as she approached him. "The dragons are ready, Varos. They can end this now." "Not yet," Varos replied, his tone steady but strained. "The wall's magic is fragile. If the dragons strike too soon, They may destroy the very barrier that keeps the dead from spilling into the realm. The Night King has yet to show himself. He's waiting, just as we are. Daenerys's expression was conflicted, but she trusted his judgment for now. If the tunnel falls, it won't, Varro said firmly, though his eyes flickered with unease. They will hold. Inside the tunnel, the White Walkers advanced further, their frost spreading across the walls and ground. The Valyrian soldiers fought valiantly, their dragonglass spears claiming several whites and even managing to wound one of the White Walker leaders. But the toll was heavy, and the strain on their formation was growing visible. Above, the roar of Maelstrom echoed, a reminder of the firepower held in reserve. Soldiers across the battlefield looked skyward, their morale bolstered by the presence of the dragons. The sight of such power gave them hope, but they knew that the true test was far from over. The living had drawn a line in the ice and fire of the wall, and they were determined to hold it. But the White Walkers were unrelenting, their eerie calm and devastating power slowly pushing the defenders to their limits. As the tide continued to shift, Varros gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. He could feel the Night King's presence growing stronger, even if the figure had yet to appear. The battle was far from decided, and the true test of the living's resolve was only just beginning.